Thank you all for being here. What a wonderful crowd and what an incredible space that I get to speak in. And I don't always get to speak in such wonderful spaces, but I'm very pleased to have you here. And I want to thank Becca for the invitation, and it's just great to be here. So the story that I have to share with you tonight, and in the interests of full disclosure, I want to let you all know that my job tonight is to try to change the way you think about the Underground Railroad. Now, if you're like me and you went to school in the United States and you learned about the Underground Railroad, you learned about it in a particular way, mainly as a land-based historical event, that people were escaping over land. And we didn't think very much about water. Now, maybe you did here in Newport, because water is your lives, it's all around you. I grew up in Ohio. And where I grew up, as we'll see on a map in a couple of minutes, we thought almost exclusively about the Underground Railroad as a land-based thing. So nowadays, I live in New Bedford, and I am very much a wash-ashore in New Bedford, if one can say that. But I wanted to draw our attention to the title, Sailing to Freedom, Uncovering and Recentering the Underground Railroad, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. And so the idea here is that I want to walk us through how, as a historian, myself and other colleagues uncovered this story, which was relatively little known, and then kind of recentered it as a major part of the Underground Railroad story. And to assert, as historians sometimes do, that this is really an important and underknown and underappreciated and under-researched story. So let's start. So this is a map of the Underground Railroad, as it is often taught. This is a map from National Geographic Society. And it shows how in American schools we're usually taught how the Underground Railroad works. And what I would like to do first is push back a little bit on what this map is telling us. So if we are to believe this map, we are to understand that people start fleeing overland from the Underground Railroad in the deep South. That they're fleeing from central Alabama and Mississippi, and they're fleeing from, northern Georgia. And they're fleeing well inland, moving hundreds of miles over land. And while there is a nod to the offshore maritime Underground Railroad, most scholarship doesn't discuss maritime escapes at all. Most scholarship focuses on the land-bound Underground Railroad, with very few exceptions. The other thing I want to say at the outset is, I worked with several really wonderful historians to create this book and to do this project and this study. There were 10 of us all together. They were men, they were women, they were African American, they were white Americans, they were young, they were old, some were at the very beginnings of their career, some were very senior. But working together, this is not a book that I could have done myself because of the geographic coverage that we covered, going all the way up and down the eastern seaboard. So here's how I'm going to push back on this map. The problem with this map is that it would have us believe that people are going hundreds of miles over land. And the historical record doesn't back that up. The historical record says, of all of the successful escapes that we know about on the land-bound Underground Railroad, almost all of them, better than 97% of them, begin within just a few days' walk of a border with a free state. And so they're starting from northern Kentucky and eastern Missouri, and they're starting from what is today West Virginia and Maryland and Delaware. But what they're not doing is traveling weeks over land, or even, a significant number of days over land, because it was simply too easy to get caught. There were structures in place by the Southern slaveholding aristocracy who put measures in place to stop people from running away. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the challenges to people escaping long distances over land. One is simply time. One is simply time. If you're traveling by foot, you might travel 10 to 15 miles in a night. And remember, you're trying to travel at a time when you're not going to be easily seen. You're trying to remain hidden. You're doing something that is clandestine and illegal. And if you're caught, you're going to be hauled back to the person who owns you. What you're almost certainly not doing is carrying a lantern. Because at night, if you want to get caught, and so much of the Underground Railroad art shows things like that, and I understand why, but it didn't happen because that's too easy to get caught. If you're traveling by horse, you might make 25, 30, maybe 35 miles in a night, but having a horse is a problem because you have to keep it hidden during the daytime, you have to feed it, there are lots of issues, and where are you going to get a horse? In the first place, you're going to steal it, and that's going to be noticed. And so most people didn't travel in this way. The other issue is that you have people who are actively looking for you all the time. There were slave patrols set up, posses set up, that were systematically covering the countryside in the South, specifically to keep enslaved people on task and working, and keep them from running away. And so, when we see badges, these happen to be from South Carolina and from Georgia, but all over the South you have slave patrols that are set up to stop people from running away overland. We actually know from historical research that a lot of people did run away overland in the Deep South, about 50,000 a year, but they all got caught before they could find their way to the north, except those people who are leaving from very close to borders with free states. If you're a person of color and you are enslaved and you're traveling, you have to carry identification with you. You have to carry permission to demonstrate that you have the person who owns you, that you have their permission to be abroad on legitimate business, traveling anywhere at any time, and at night. Now, people who were enslaved did travel at night, sometimes on official business, but if they did, they had permission, and they had evidence of their permission. So they had tags that identified them as a servant, as a porter, as a mechanic, and other things, and they were numbered, and they were registered with the slave patrol, so they could know who was able to travel legally and legitimately. They had written permissions that were, the people who had lanterns were the guys who were looking for the enslaved people and who would check their permission slips. And we have hundreds and hundreds of permission slips written by slave owners for their slaves to travel. These are archived in historical societies such as this one. So it was really hard to escape overland. Furthermore, things like animals trained to track down enslaved people. There were people who specialized in training dogs to go after human property and find enslaved people who were trying to escape. And some of the most dramatic art of the Underground Railroad are these confrontations between enslaved people escaping and the dogs that are sent after them. So, escaping overland had huge challenges. If we contrast that to escaping over water, if you manage to get on board of a ship in the South, and you have the knowledge and the cooperation of a northern-based crew, once you're aboard and hidden, the effort that you have to put into escaping is minimal. You stay hidden, you can travel quickly. Ships traveled 24 hours a day, maybe making 3 knots or 4 miles an hour-ish, but over 24 hours, you can make 130, 140, 150 miles a day. It was a 5-day sail up the Gulf Stream from Charleston, South Carolina to New York. It was fast, and it was relatively secure. And any enslaved person working along the coast in the South knew that. It was obvious. So I want to talk a little bit about, we'll talk more about ships in a moment and port cities and so on. But this is a map of the Underground Railroad that was published in 1898. It's by a historian from The Ohio State University, William H. Siebert, who wrote a book the end of the 19th century in which he had personally interviewed a lot of people who were either operatives of the Underground Railroad or who had escaped on the Underground Railroad. And he did a lot of his interviews by correspondence, but he did some of them personally. And what he was able to do is map overland routes where he knew people had escaped on the Underground Railroad. He's able to map the direction that they took. Now, I was born in Detroit. My father was from Michigan. My mother was from near Dayton, Ohio, and I grew up largely around here. This whole area is crisscrossed by Underground Railroad routes. Detroit was a very important crossover point from the United States to Canada. So a lot of people came through there. But southern Ohio, southwest Ohio, north of Cincinnati, everywhere from the Ohio River up is just riddled with Underground Railroad sites. And that's what I grew up thinking about. It never occurred to me that people would escape over water until I came to Boston for graduate school. I started sailing. I started sailing because I was studying overseas empires, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to learn about overseas colonization, I need to learn how to sail, because you can't have colonies overseas unless you know how to sail. And so I came to Mystic Seaport, and I started sailing, and then I sailed on a bunch of different ships, and I taught programs on board ships. And I started to learn about how sailing worked, and logbooks, and navigation. And then I moved to New Bedford 20 years ago to take up a job at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And I wanted to live in New Bedford because New Bedford's great. It's great for a lot of reasons, but a lot of my faculty colleagues looked at me and said, "You're crazy to live in New Bedford." And I thought, no, New Bedford is awesome. It's got whaling history. And what I didn't know much about was the fact that New Bedford was a terminal point on the Underground Railroad. It was a destination, an objective for people escaping. And my eyes were opened to that by a woman named Lee Blake, who is the director of the New Bedford Historical Society. New Bedford actually has two historical societies. It has the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, which focuses mainly on whaling and the history of white people in New Bedford, and the New Bedford Historical Society, which focuses exclusively on the stories of people of color. Not only African Americans, but Cape Verdeans, Native Americans, anyone from the Pacific Islands who came for the whaling business. They focus on people of color. And so Lee Blake, this real dynamo of a director of the New Bedford Historical Society, said, "Hey, Tim," she took me aside and she said, "Look, New Bedford has this incredible story to tell about being central to the Underground Railroad in this area. Would you like to collaborate?" And after about 5 minutes, I was totally on board. And so we put together this National Endowment for the Humanities workshop for teachers through a program called Landmarks in American History, for K through 12 teachers, and we ran that program in 2011, 2013, 2015, and at that point we said, oh, we got to do a book about this. And then we did it again in 2022, and we have been refunded for this year, so we're doing it again. Any of you who have friends, or if you are yourselves teachers, you can apply to come to New Bedford for a week and learn about New Bedford and the Underground Railroad, and be paid by federal dollars to do that. So we did this for a number of years, and we started to think about this story. Now, a big part of the story is that in the late 18th and early 19th century, late 1700s, early 1800s, an astonishingly large number of sailors on American flagged vessels were African Americans. Some of them are free, some of them are enslaved. The free people do it and collect their own wages. The enslaved people give their wages to the people who own them. But almost 20% of the sailors on American flagged vessels and merchant vessels, military vessels, whaling vessels, they're people of color. They're African Americans. And we know this because Jeff Bolster, a great colleague of mine, he may have actually spoken here, I'm not sure. He was at the University of New Hampshire. He wrote a book, came out in 1998, called Blackjacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail. And he did the footwork, established that there was this very large community of African American sailors. So we've got thousands of merchant vessels constantly going up and down the coast of the United States, along the eastern seaboard. If you wanted to move heavy cargo, you had to do it by sea. I realize that many of you this is obvious, but I'm often giving this talk for landlubbers, so please bear with me. There were no bridges, there were no roads, there were no railroads, there were no ways to get across the inland, the inlets from the ocean all along Virginia and much of the eastern seaboard. There was constantly a cloud of vessels under sail, schooners, sloops, brigs, full-rigged ships, smaller vessels, carrying cargo from the north to the south, from the south to the north. America's cargo moved by water. And those cargo vessels needed crew, and 20% of the crew were were African American. This provides certain opportunities, especially when you consider that in the South, prior to the Civil War, most of the labor in the ports were enslaved African Americans. South of the Mason-Dixon line, in the slaveholding South, the labor force on the waterfronts and even on the water were largely enslaved African Americans. Now we think about slave labor as being mostly agricultural work on plantations, maybe domestic servants in households, but African Americans were doing all kinds of other labor. They kept the US economy running, but especially in the South. So what kind of work is being done by enslaved African Americans in southern seaports? They're doing everything. They're waterfront dock and wharf workers, they're longshoremen and stevedores loading and unloading ships. And that was skilled labor, because you have to load a ship properly so its trim is correct and it will sail right. It was skilled work. They're warehousemen, they're drovers and teamsters. They are skilled shipyard labor doing rigging and sail making and caulking of hulls. It's skilled labor that is absolutely essential to the churning on of the Southern economy. And so essential was their work that the Southern slave-owning class said, we can't really do away with them. We have to keep these people working in our ports. We can't replace them with free laborers. And we know that some of them are using their opportunities in the ports to escape, but we're not going to change our labor force because our economy is based on this. Not only are they working on the waterfronts, they're also working on the water. They are skilled watermen. They're mariners. They are essential skilled labor as fishermen, oystermen. They're running ferries. They are working on lighters, which are big boats you use to load and unload ships that are not on a dock. They're on a mooring or on an anchorage. They're deckhands and even pilots, although they couldn't have the title of pilot because that title was reserved for white pilots. They called them wheelmen because they navigated a vessel. They're often working with great autonomy. They're running their own ferries and their own fishing boats and their oyster boats with entirely enslaved crew. The captain is an enslaved person, and they're working with no oversight from any owner or anyone of the owner class. Instead, they're learning these really essential skills and generating revenue for their owners. This is a map of the 1860 census, right on the cusp of the Civil War. And it shows where African American populations were centered. And if we look, the most darkly shaded areas are where you have 70 and even 80% of the population are African American, mostly enslaved. And all of those mostly shaded areas are in the port cities along the southern coast and in the Virginia tidewater areas. They're there because waterborne transport means that the only way to get the plantation-produced crops out to market is to bring them down these tidal waterways on boats, bring them to a place where they can be loaded onto larger ships and taken out to market. And all of that work is also being done by enslaved watermen. So all along the eastern seaboard, you have these big concentrations around the seaports and in the waterways of enslaved African American people. And that means that you've got all these people working in maritime industries, learning about ports, learning how a port functions. They were in a position to know when ships were getting ready to clear customs and leave harbor. They were in a position to know when they're loading and unloading a ship, they can leave little hidey holes for themselves to get into. They know the nooks and crannies of vessels. They have an opportunity when a northern ship comes down to be loaded with southern lumber or cotton or grain or whatever it is. They have an opportunity when they're loading the ship to interact with the white crew from the north, some of whom will have abolitionist tendencies, and who will suggest to them, hey, you seem like a really nice guy, a stand-up worker, why don't you come away with us? And that happened pretty regularly. So, working in a waterfront and a harbor gives you strategic knowledge which you can use as an opportunity for escape. And this is happening again and again and again in the southern ports. This is just South Carolina. You can see the inland, the tidal waterways, and this is where the African American population is concentrated. 81%, 65%, 85% of these areas are African Americans. Southern politicians knew this was happening. We have the governor of Maryland, Thomas Pratt, in the 1840s saying his state is losing about $80,000 worth of human property a year through the ports of Maryland. In Virginia, the Senator James Mason says it's $100,000 worth of people. And that translates into hundreds and hundreds of people every year just from 2 states. And it's going on up and down the east coast of the United States and the South. So, and because they have these maritime skills, they are leveraging those skills in order to get away. So, now I hope I've convinced you that this is actually happening. Now let's look at the evidence. How do historians know that African Americans were escaping enslavement by sea using ships and boats? What's the evidence? Well, we're going to show you several different kinds of evidence. One of them, the first one we're going to look at, is runaway slave advertisements that appear in American newspapers, North American newspapers. So runaway slave advertisements. We're also going to look at laws and ordinances passed by southern municipalities and southern states. We're also going to look at published accounts by enslaved people who get away and then later write about their escape attempts. Of 103 known slave escape narratives, 70% of them recount escape by water as the means by which they got away. Now, this is a bit of a self-selecting group because people who worked in the maritime trades were more likely to be literate. But it still is an astonishing figure that if we're not thinking about maritime escape at all, it means that it's a really important part of the story of the Underground Railroad. The final piece of evidence that we'll look at are abolitionist accounts of escapes, and they very frequently mention people escaping by water as well. So here's a very typical runaway slave ad. It's quite early. It's from before the Revolution, 1772. It's from the Williamsburg Gazette in Virginia. And runaway slave ads typically have a number of things. They have a physical description of the person who has escaped. Usually says something about, their physical description, about what they were wearing. But almost always, because these are put in the newspaper by an owner who wants his or her very valuable property back, it will give some indication as to how they suspect their person has escaped. And it'll usually offer an award. So the part that I've highlighted, and these are long S's, so it's not an F, it's an S. This is a guy, his name is Phil, he's about 20 years of age, 5'9". He has some experience as a mariner. As he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. So, the idea here is that we're going to prosecute you if you help people to escape, because this is a felony, valuable property, but we're also acknowledging that this is happening with people escaping by water. Here's the next one, 1796, Philadelphia. $10 reward, absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday afternoon, Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl. Here's your first test. Who's President of the United States in 1796? George Washington, exactly. So at the time, Philadelphia is the national capital. Washington is there. He is now, Pennsylvania is a free state by 1796, but there's a grandfather clause so that slave owners can bring household servants who are enslaved to Philadelphia for up to 6 months, and if they don't rotate their slaves back, those persons can be freed by law. Oni Judge, 20 years old, knew that she was about to be rotated back to Mount Vernon. And she also worried that she was going to be sold to someone who she didn't like. And so, according to the ad here, but as she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board. In fact, she did use a ship to escape. She got on board a ship in the port of Philadelphia, sailed down through the Delaware Bay, and then up the coast, and she ends up in New Hampshire, where she lives the rest of her life in freedom. She publishes her story when she's much older in the 1820s. Washington, for his part, was incensed. He wanted her back, and he spent the rest of his life, which was only 3 years after this, he dies in 1799, he tries to get her back. And even as President of the United States, he did not have the power to challenge state laws in New Hampshire that protected Oni Judge's right to be in New Hampshire. So he never gets her back. Here's another one. This is from 1810. It's Baltimore. This is a guy named Jack, 5'8" or 9, calls himself Jack Alexander. His object is to go to sea, and he'll be trying to ship out on board some vessel bound out. Note below, all masters of vessels and others are forewarned, harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. So what we have is again and again and again, when we started looking at these, how many runaway slave ads are there in the world? 220,000 individual runaway slave ads in American newspapers from about the 1740s until the end of the Civil War in 1865. 220,000. And they're scattered all over lots of different historical societies and libraries and archives. There's an effort to try to get them all together into a single searchable database. It's still quite divided, so it's a little bit hard to do research, but we have a lot of these. And when we started looking for them, first we found dozens, then we found scores, and then we found hundreds. There are a lot of runaway slave ads that mention escape by sea. Here's another one. This is from 1838. As very little doubt can be entertained of his conveyance away on board some vessel, I will give the further reward of $500 for the conviction and punishment agreeable to law of the master or captain, and half that sum for any of the crew or other persons who are engaged in this felonious act. So there's starting to be teeth to the laws to prosecute mariners who assist people running away. Runaway, so this is another one. I want to draw attention to this simply because it actually points out that both of these people who have tried to escape, Mary and William, both of them have had for a long time relations with the Negro fishermen in the bayou. So they're suspecting that they're being helped by African-American fishermen in the mid-19th century. This one's really interesting. This is not a runaway slave ad. Instead, it's a legal notice placed in a New Bedford newspaper by a sea captain who has been implicated in an escape. Now, this is early. It's 1797. Many of us are aware of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But there was actually an earlier Fugitive Slave Act passed by Congress in 1793. As soon as the northern states started to eliminate slavery in the North, they had to come up with some means to address the fact that enslaved people were running away to the North. It didn't have the teeth that the 1850 Act had, but what it did say is that if you were knowingly helping or assisting someone to escape, you could be prosecuted. But if you weren't knowingly an assistant, then you were legally covered. And so what's happening here is a captain is putting a notice in the paper to provide himself and his crew and his ship, so that it wouldn't be confiscated, with legal coverage in an incident where someone has escaped. So we kind of have to read between the lines here, and I'll leave it to you to ask whether or not you think the captain is telling the truth here. So, public legal notice. To all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from the York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford. That on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. I had nothing to do with it, didn't know he was there, he just turned up on my vessel. That's what he's saying. Then it gets really interesting. It appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him in this port, New Bedford. So what he's saying is, I'm on a sailboat, don't have an engine, I'm in the Gulf Stream, the wind was behind me, there was no way I could turn around and bring this human property back to his rightful owner. He calls his name James, he's about 27 years old, and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. Is that really his name? We don't know. Does he really belong to Mr. Shackelford? We don't know. Probably yes. Any person claiming him will know by this information that I am publishing in a public newspaper, by this information, where he is, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing his property in my power, William Tabor, 1797, New Bedford. Now, newspapers circulated up and down the East Coast. Mr. Shackelford probably would eventually get a copy of this and know that James was in New Bedford on April 20th. But this was a weekly publication, and it would take weeks for it to get to Virginia. And by that time, James could be anywhere. He could be in Canada, he could be in upstate New York, who knows. Publishing this serves the purposes of protecting the captain, and it does nothing to harm James's chances of getting away. And we see a lot of these kinds of ads in New Bedford newspapers. So, really fascinating document of the Maritime Underground Railroad. Was there an interdiction capacity to stop people moving slaves up the East Coast? Yes. We did have revenue cutters. We had the Massachusetts and the Eagle that are out in territorial waters of the United States to stop smuggling and to stop vessels that they suspect of carrying contraband, like runaway slaves. But in the 19th century, right up into almost World War I, actually, territorial waters were 3 miles. And once you're 3 miles offshore, you're in international water. And the Coast Guard couldn't touch you. And so this worked to the advantage. If a ship is leaving and clearing a harbor in the south, within an hour or so, they're going to be offshore and safe. So again, if you're traveling as a runaway slave aboard a ship, it's safer, it's faster, it's easier to move by water than by land, by a long shot. Speaking of long shot, 3 miles offshore was about the distance a cannon could shoot. That's why 3 miles was the limit. So now we're going to talk. How am I doing on time? We good? When would you like me to stop? All right. Okay. As long as you're happy, I'm happy. You can turn me on and I go. All right. So southern municipalities and states started to pass laws to control the people who they thought were most responsible for encouraging enslaved people to run away. And the people that they thought were most responsible were those free black African-American sailors. So beginning in 1822 in South Carolina, and then later in the southern states, they all pass ordinances to control the movements of people on board ships who are African-American sailors. Because what they don't want is having them interact with the enslaved people working in the ports of the South. And so what does this mean in practice? It means that when they're in harbor, they have to remain confined to their ships, or they are incarcerated in southern ports, held in jails at the expense of the ship. Their captain has to pay for their room and board, if you will, in these jails in the South. And of course, this is a huge disincentive for captains to hire African American sailors. And so the number of African American sailors going to southern ports starts to drop in the 1820s and 1830s as these laws start to be passed. The other thing that southern states start to do is they set up stations in ports to search northern ships that are leaving for northern ports. They do systematic searching below ships for stowaways, and they set up fumigation stations to burn brimstone and sulfur below the decks in an effort to drive out anyone who might be hidden amongst the cargo below decks. And we have numerous stories of enslaved African Americans being below decks and choking, not dying, but like weathering this kind of a search and surviving and continuing out of the harbor. Now we have a number of stories of people who actually managed to escape and then published about it later on. One of the best known ones is a guy named Thomas Jones. He was a longshoreman in Wilmington, North Carolina for years. And in 1849, he stowed away, unbeknownst to the captain. Oh, I thought that was going to happen. Sorry, you have to look over here. He stows away, unbeknownst to the captain, gets aboard a brig called the Belle, and he sails off to New York. The captain discovers he's on board, and the captain is worried about being prosecuted. And so, when they get to New York, he anchors well offshore, about 2 miles, and he goes ashore in one of the ship's boats in order to find a federal marshal, and he's going to turn Thomas Jones over to the federal marshal. Thomas Jones, who has the free run of the ship because they're not afraid that he's going to swim, he throws together a rough-built raft of some loose boards, didn't look nearly as nice as this, and he makes a run for it. He tries to get to shore. He's followed by the first officer, the first mate, and some crew members who are going to try to recapture him, but he is providentially picked up by 2 northern abolitionist-minded sailors who get him in their boat, get him on shore, get him into a safe house. Eventually he goes to New Bedford, and then he goes to Boston, and in 1862, just after the Civil War starts, he publishes an account of how he had escaped. And so we know about how this happened. Another account is very well known, the story of Harriet Jacobs, who publishes in, I think it's the 1870s. She escapes in 1842, but she publishes a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Actually, it might be she publishes before the Civil War. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's in the yeah, you're right. It's 1860, precisely. And in this book, she outlines in very guarded Victorian language the physical abuse that she's endured as a woman who's enslaved. And so this book, which is very widely distributed by abolitionists, opens people's eyes to some of the dangers of being an enslaved woman in the United States. Her brother is a guy called John Jacobs. He also escapes by water. By the way, I forgot to mention, she endures 7 years hiding in an attic in Edenton, North Carolina, waiting for an opportunity to get aboard a ship. She escapes. They're looking for her. She's still in town, but she's hiding in a house, in a loft. And then she finally gets aboard a ship and gets away. Her brother escaped in 1848. And he goes to New Bedford, signs aboard a whaling voyage. Pause. If you're a runaway African-American enslaved male, there's hardly any better place that you can go to get away from people who would recapture you than aboard a whaling ship that's going to take you to the other side of the world for years at a time. Average time of a whaling voyage is 2 to 3 years. You're going to earn a little bit of money because the whalers pay you at the same rate they pay any other green hand new sailor. So he does that. He learns how to read and write. He spends a lot of time as a merchant sailor in the Pacific Ocean. and in the Atlantic. And in 1855, he has gotten off a ship in Australia to go hunt for opals in the opal mining craze in the 1850s in Australia. And he walks into a newspaper office in Sydney, and he says, I want to publish my story about being an enslaved person in the United States. And they publish his story over 4 issues of the newspaper, a huge account that is absolutely scathing about American slavery. This account could not have been published in England, it could not have been published in the United States, but the Australians published it. And then it was forgotten about until about 3 years ago when a colleague of ours at RISD, his name is Jonathan Schroeder, finds this account in an Australian newspaper and publishes it by Chicago University Press in last year, in 2024. The title, and the original title by John Jacobs, is The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots, and what he's referring to is the number of people who owned slaves in the United States in 1855. So the other exciting thing about this is that Jonathan Schroeder identified this painting, which is at the African American Museum of Philadelphia. We were able to use it for a Sailing to Freedom exhibition in 2022, but it had only been identified a few months before we used it. He's holding a copy of the Liberator newspaper. He becomes an advocate, a very vocal advocate, like Frederick Douglass, for abolition. And his story was largely forgotten until Jonathan Schroeder at RISD figured this out and has published a lot about it. So I like to talk about this book whenever I can, and it's a riveting read. It's really amazing. Another guy that I want to talk about is Daniel Drayton, who was the captain on board a ship called the Pearl. And he writes a memoir about his experience as a sea captain going up and down the coast. And in the memoir, he has this quote: "No sooner does a vessel known to be from the north anchor in any of these waters," he's talking about the Chesapeake Bay, "than she is boarded by African Americans in hopes of obtaining a passage in her to a land of freedom." According to his account, it was absolutely common. Whenever a northern ship was isolated at anchor in a quiet anchorage, people would swarm aboard asking to get away. He is hired by a group of abolitionists based in Massachusetts to take away a family that is enslaved in Washington, D.C. And so he pulls up his schooner called the Pearl to the waterfront in D.C., which is now really close to where the Jefferson Memorial is, and he waits for these handful of enslaved people to get on board. But word had gotten out, and 77 people got on board his vessel trying to get away from D.C. The problem is that many of these persons who are human property were owned by some of the most powerful people in Washington. They were owned by members of Congress. They were owned by people who worked in the various departments. And so he gets away from the waterfront. He makes his way down the Potomac River with the tide. He's on an old rickety schooner. And he gets to the mouth of the Potomac, and the wind is not favorable. And so he has to anchor and wait for a favorable wind. Meanwhile, word has gone around in D.C. that a bunch of people were missing, and they got together a posse on a steam vessel and went after him, and they caught him. The people who were enslaved, who had had jobs as domestic servants in Washington, were all sold down the river to the Deep South. That's the origin of that expression, by the way. To be sold down the river means to be sold as an enslaved person to the death sentence of working in plantations in the South. He goes to prison. That's where they were caught, at the mouth of the Potomac River. Drayton goes to prison for 4 years. He comes back to New Bedford, and he ends up dying in New Bedford, and he's in a cemetery. His tomb is in a cemetery about 500 yards from where I live. So there's a picture of it in the book, his tomb, which is taken care of by the New Bedford Historical Society. But he becomes a hero among abolitionists for his attempt to break out this huge number of people on this schooner. Here's another one. Elizabeth Blakely, 15 years old, escapes from Wilmington, North Carolina in 1850, and she endures about 2 weeks at sea in the winter. She gets frostbite, but she survives. She's free, and she lives. Her story is not published until W.B. Du Bois in the 1920s publishes her account, and she lives a good long life in freedom. Another account by an abolitionist, this is a guy named Austin Bierce, who in 1880 publishes a book called Reminiscences of Fugitive Slave Law Days in Boston. And in it, this is an original image from the book, he recounts how in Boston Harbor, when ships from the South would arrive, they would send a boat out with typically an African-American woman on board to sell treats to the sailors, pies and cakes and bits of clothing and things like that. And she would discreetly inquire, do you have any contraband on board? And if the answer was yes, then later, in the middle of the night, they would send out Austin Bierce's yacht called the Moby Dick. In 1853, just 3 years after the book had been published, he named his yacht after Melville's book in 1853. And they would take off the enslaved person, get them on shore in the middle of the night, and get them to a safe house and get them to Canada or wherever they could be safe. Another incredible book by William Still. Many of you will have heard of William Still. He was an Underground Railroad operative. He had a house near the waterfront in Philadelphia. He was a free black man, relatively young, and for several years in the 1850s, he operated a free house near the waterfront in Philadelphia. In 1872, he publishes a book called The Underground Railroad. And what he had done is, while he was a safe house operator for about 7 or 8 years, he kept detailed records of everyone that he helped. Not a very smart thing to do, because if he had been caught, he would have been prosecuted. But thankfully he wasn't caught, and when he publishes essentially his diary, we have detailed accounts of over 600 people whom he helped, many of whom were people who escaped by water through the port of Philadelphia. One of the incidents that he recounts in his book is this guy, Captain James Watson Fountain, who had a schooner called the City of Richmond. This was a packet schooner that ran a regular route up and down the East Coast. And he was suspected of helping people to escape systematically. He was doing that. So in Norfolk, Virginia, in November of 1855, the city of Norfolk sent a delegation on board to search his vessel. And they said, Captain, we think that you are moving contraband people from the south to the north. He feigns indignation. He seizes an axe and he says, I will show you that I don't have people on board. And he starts to hack into his deck, and no captain in his right mind would do that to his vessel. And so they back off. And he had 21 people on board when that incident happened. He gets them safely to Philadelphia. This is not the same incident, but it's another incident where a large number of persons are offloaded secretly in the middle of the night in Philadelphia at an island called League Island. And I love this image particularly because it really underscores the advantages of maritime escape. Children could escape without making noise and jeopardizing an overland escape by crying or being hungry. People who couldn't easily travel, someone who was overweight, entire families could escape by water. They couldn't do that overland. You just couldn't do it overland. And so another thing that's interesting here is that the Underground Railroad operatives are shown as being people of color. We tend to forget that the Underground Railroad operatives were often free black people in the North. In fact, a big point of my book that I want to emphasize is that far too often the Underground Railroad history is presented as being well-meaning white people helping poor black people to escape. And the narrative of our book turns that on its head, because it puts the emphasis and the agency directly on the people who are escaping, who leverage their own skills and their own knowledge of the sea to get away. And by seeing that we have a lot of African American Underground Railroad operatives in the North who are putting people into carriages with covered windows so prying eyes can't see in, it underscores the importance of the systematic Underground Railroad as it functions in the North, often with people of African American descent. If you'll bear with me, I just have a few more slides of examples of people who escaped. This one is particularly good. Dempsey Hill, who ends up as a pleasure boat captain in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, but he had been a waterman in Beaufort, North Carolina at the time the Civil War breaks out. And as a waterman, he knew where there were charts not hidden, in the custom house of Beaufort. And he knows that the blockading Union ships could really use those charts because it marks all of the navigational hazards. So he steals them. And he hides them in a cemetery. And he rounds up a few of his waterman buddies. And the next night they steal a pilot boat and they sail out to the Union Navy. And they turn these charts over to the Navy. And they're immediately they're enrolled in the Navy as able-bodied seamen, not landsmen. They are recognized for their maritime skill. So they're rated AB and able-bodied, and they immediately find work. And he serves throughout the war. And after the war, he works as a merchant seaman for a while. And then he settles in Massachusetts. And he is so valued as a pleasure boat captain leading fishing trips in Buzzards Bay. When he dies in 1894, he gets a full column obituary in the Boston Globe. And for an African-American man to get an obituary in the Boston Globe at the end of the 19th century is pretty extraordinary. Another guy who you may know about is Robert Smalls, who steals out from under the nose of the Confederate Navy an entire gunboat. And he does that because he was part of the crew. He was the wheelman, the pilot of this boat. The boat had 9 crew members and 3 officers. The officers were white. The officers went ashore for a party one evening. And Robert Smalls saw his chance. He was about 20 years old at the time. And he gets his crew together. He says, tonight we're leaving. They arrange to meet their families at another wharf. They pick up their families. And so more than 20 people leave. And thankfully, Robert Smalls' wife remembered to bring a big white sheet to show to the Union Navy when they get out to the blockading ships. It was a big risk that they were going to be fired on. But they showed a white flag. They were not fired on. He turns this vessel over to the Union Navy, and the Union Navy assigns a white officer to run it, and he makes a real mess of it. In fact, thanks to Smalls, they escape from an attempt to recapture the vessel, and because Smalls knows how he can navigate through the Charleston waters. Anyway, the point is that this man, Robert Smalls, becomes the first African-American man to command officially a United States warship. It gets better. After the war, he represents his community as a member of Congress during Reconstruction. He buys the home of his enslaver and lives in it. He takes care of his enslaver's wife when she gets sick and the enslaver has died. He ends his life as a customs officer in the service of the port that he grew up in. It's an extraordinary story, and there is a film in the works about this, I'm told, but it hasn't been completed yet. Oops. So we know that this is happening. Harper's Weekly, in the middle of the Civil War, they published stories about this. We can look at a map that we made from the book where we have all the sites from which people are escaping, and we can compare that map to where we know people are living. It's happening a lot. I can't tell you how many people go away because, bless you, this is illegal activity, it's clandestine, it does not leave a paper trail. We often only find out about people escaping when they're recaptured. But we don't really know how many successful escapes there are. We can only estimate. But we know it's in the thousands. And we know that as a story of the only way to escape from the maritime south, the deep south, is by water. You can't do it over land. We have no evidence of people escaping over land. I'm going to finish up very quickly with a couple of things about New Bedford. This is a runaway slave ad that talks about New Bedford. New Bedford was known in the South as a place toward which people should try to escape, where they could earn a living, where they could be safe, where they could be protected, because New Bedford had a very active abolitionist community that was both black and white. New Bedford, Massachusetts, prior to the Civil War, had the highest percentage of people of color living in the city of any northern city, more than Boston, more than Philadelphia, more than New York, as a percentage of the population. Not in raw numbers. New York and Boston had more people, but as a percentage of the population in New Bedford, it was far bigger than anywhere else. And many of those folks were escaped enslaved people. My colleague Catherine Grover wrote a book called The Fugitives Gibraltar, which is what New Bedford was known as. New Bedford prided itself that no one was ever taken back into enslavement from New Bedford. You couldn't say that about Philadelphia or New York or Boston. And so it was a very safe place where the people were absolutely militant about protecting people who escaped from slavery. Why? A fair question. The whaling industry is largely in the hands of Quakers. And Quakers, by the late 18th century, were abolitionists, militantly abolitionist. And so the Quaker ship owners wanted to have provide an opportunity for people escaping from enslavement to work on their whaling ships. It was a mutually helpful opportunity for them. They always needed labor on their ships, and it helped to get African Americans away from bounty hunters who would take them back to enslavement. So New Bedford becomes known as the Fugitives Gibraltar. But there were other people on Nantucket, Absalom Boston, who lived until 1855. He's one of the first African Americans to command a whaling vessel from Nantucket. We have the example of Paul Cuffey, who's even earlier. Cuffey's story is extraordinary. He's from Westport, Mass., but he sailed out of New Bedford. He takes merchant ships with entirely African American crews into Britain, into the port of Bristol and Liverpool, and it makes the British newspapers, because this is at a time when the United States is still a slave-holding nation. He sues the state of Massachusetts for the right to vote as a free man of property, and he wins. He founds the first racially integrated school in Westport, Massachusetts. His son was a whaling captain with all black crews. This is the enrollment list of his ship, the Rising States. And you can look at the physical descriptions showing the skin color and the hair and know that everybody on board is a person of African descent. In 1837, long before the Civil War. Frederick Douglass comes to New Bedford in 1838. He is a trained caulker. He knows how to do caulking work on ships, although he's not able to do that immediately upon his arrival. He escapes with the help of a Freeman's Protection paper that falsely identifies him as a free black sailor. He wasn't, but he looked the part, and he could walk the walk, and he could talk the talk, and he was never asked to identify himself. So he makes it to New Bedford using this maritime ruse. This is the home that he lived in. Two people of color who were abolitionists, Nathan and Polly Johnson. This home still stands. It is a museum. You may visit it. I invite you all, I encourage you all to please come to New Bedford and see our Maritime Underground Railroad walking tour. And this is also the headquarters of the aforementioned New Bedford Historical Society. It's right next to the Quaker Meeting House from the 18th century, and cat-a-corner across the street is the new Quaker Meeting House, built in 1822. It's new, and it's only 200 years old. And we have a brand new statue of Douglass as he appeared as a 21-year-old man with his wife, Anna, who arrived in New Bedford, and he made his home in New Bedford for 7 years. He found his voice as an abolitionist there. His sons served in the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the all-black infantry regiment. But anyone escaping with maritime skills could find work in New Bedford. Two final examples. Lewis Temple, who revolutionizes the whaling industry by inventing the toggle head harpoon, was a blacksmith who escaped from Richmond, Virginia by water, ends up in New Bedford, changes the whaling industry, never patented it, so he didn't make a lot of money on it. But he's remembered with a statue outside the City Hall for how this runaway enslaved person made a huge change in New Bedford's economy. Also, the first African-American soldier to earn the Medal of Honor is a New Bedford guy who escaped from Norfolk, Virginia, ends up in New Bedford, joins the 54th Massachusetts, carries the flag at the Battle of Fort Wagner. If you've seen the movie Glory, he's depicted in it. He's shot 7 times, never lets the flag touch the ground, survives the war, works as a letter carrier, a member of the Postal Service in New Bedford for many years. And he is the first person to earn the Medal of Honor. He's not the first to receive it. He actually doesn't get it for a while afterwards, but his acts of valor predate anyone else who did this. If we look at the art of whaling, African Americans are front and center. This guy is having a bad day. But I want to draw your attention not to him, but to this man who is an officer, a person of color who's a boat steerer on a whaling boat, commanding white sailors, but he's in charge, and he's a black man in the stern of the boat called the boat steerer. And if we look at the art of the whaling business, African Americans are everywhere throughout it. You just have to, it's hidden in plain sight. We had an exhibition about this subject that was at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It was up in November, up until November 22. It's now entirely online. You can access it through the website of the aforementioned New Bedford Historical Society. And it's currently a traveling exhibition. It's at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum right now. We hope that it's going to go up in Philadelphia at the African American Museum of Philadelphia. And we hope it's going to be in Charleston, South Carolina, beginning in September of 2025. Thank you very much. Thank you.